So what in the world can we get out of the laws? We are firmly in the laws of Exodus today. And so we are in chapters 21 and 22 of Exodus. So let's get into it. Hi, I'm Heather from the Feet of Jesus, where we are going through the entire Bible, one book at a time. And we are in Exodus, and we are in chapters 21 and 22 today. And so chapters 21, 22, and half of 23 are actually the laws. And so we are going to get through it, and we're going to actually learn some interesting stuff from it. So let's start with kind of an idea, an overview of the laws. You know, the laws were hugely broad. They were very much expansions of many of the commandments. And so, you know, we have employment law. We have how to handle servants, murder and violent assault. We have taking responsibility for animals, property theft, restitution, rape, idolatry, how to treat the disadvantaged. You have this huge amount of laws, right? And in all of these, they are broad categories, but they really show the wisdom and the love, the compassion, and the character of God. It's amazing what we're able to see through this. So many of these laws would not fit into our modern culture, right? But they show us what God values in laws and in society and in decorum in a society. And those values should and can be brought into our daily life. So let's look at some of the broad categories. We're first going to start with one of the more difficult ones for our modern ears to understand, and that's slavery. So that's chapter 21, verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 through 11. And so, like I was saying, that really is difficult for our modern eyes to really understand, because we, especially here in the United States, we see in our mind's eye, when you say the word slavery, we see the horrors of American slavery and how people were mistreated. But in that society, it looked a little different. First of all, slavery was predominantly, not always, but predominantly voluntary. So if someone couldn't pay their debt, they could actually voluntarily place themselves under servitude of that person and work off their debt. They didn't have credit cards. They didn't have banks to give loans. And so if they couldn't pay off a debt, they could offer themselves up to pay debt. Another thing that we can see through these laws is that God humanized the slave. He humanized the servant. And I think that's important to see, because slavery was not invented here in the Bible. Slavery has been going on since almost the founding of man. And so when God humanizes the slave, I think, Heather's opinion, it leads to the dissolution of slavery. And so I think when you really look at it, you know, look at some of these verses and the protection of the slave. We see in verse 2, it says that if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and then on the 7th go free. And then we see in verse 3, if he comes in married, then his wife will go with him. And then we see in verse 8, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her, meaning the slave owner. And then in verse 10, if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. So you really see a lot of protection for the servant, for the slave here. That's God. That's the character of God. That's his wisdom and his love. And okay. So then we have violence, and that's verses 12 through 27. Predominantly what we see here is it stresses kindness, respect of others. You see it all the way through here. It's really an expansion of the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. And so one of the things we see here that sometimes an interesting thing to point out is capital punishment. So the Bible doesn't consider capital punishment murder, because capital punishment is used for murder, for child sacrifice, for kidnapping. Here's a big one, you ready? For cursing your mother and father, for idolatry, and more that we will eventually get into. So capital punishment is defined as is righteously administered judicial execution. Again, it's righteously administered judicial execution. So when we're looking at violence and then the laws that come with it, we need to remember that what God is saying is that on a personal level, we still need to forgive. But on a societal level, we need to seek justice. So then we're going to move on to chapter 22, and that's property law. So in property law, it's based on restitution, not punishment. And again, in our modern societies, I'm not sure how we would bring that in, but it could be just a level of understanding that we have that, you know, if someone hurt or stole property from you, they had to give it back double. So it really was under the idea of restitution, not send them away to prison, which really helped the person that had the stuff stolen from them. So, you know, and one thing that I thought of when I was reading these things is the whole idea of restitution is such a blessing, because we still have cultures in our world today where if you steal something, your hand is chopped off. And this is a God of wisdom who knew that restitution and having to repay double or sometimes triple what you stole was far more respectful of not only the property owner that had the thing stolen, but also the person who stole. It is a way to gain your self-worth back. So then we have in verse 16, something that sounds horrific, but I wanted to look at it. In verse 16, it says, if a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Sounds horrible. It's rape. And in rape, you know, the last thing we would ever want to do is make the victim marry the offender. But in that day, women didn't often have a choice of who they were marrying. And what this did in that day is protect the woman. So if a woman had been raped in that day, her life was over because she wasn't going to be married as a virgin anymore. And so it was a really big problem if a woman was raped. It meant, in a different way than it means now, it did mean her whole life was ruined. And so by forcing that person to actually marry her actually was a protection for the woman. And then the last thing I want to talk about with just all of the laws in general is just that people see these laws and they say, see, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. You know, that's in these chapters. And that just shows that you all serve an unmerciful tyrant of a God. When it's actually so the exact opposite. And we see that God wanted the punishment to actually fit the crime. He knows our hearts. He knows human nature is revenge. He knows that if you get in a fight with someone and they knock out a tooth, our revengeful hearts are going to want to give them a whole set of dentures. He knows that if something happens, that someone knocks at your eye and makes you blind, that person is actually going to want to make the other person blind altogether. And so he knows our hearts. And so by saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, he was actually saying that the punishment should actually fit the crime. He was saying that I know that you all are vengeful. I know your hearts. And let's make crimes fit the crimes. You know, he was actually really kind of trying to help the judges make wise decisions by outlining all the things that would come about with these laws. So we'll get into a little bit more laws next week with chapter 23. But then we're going to get into the angel and the promises. So that should be interesting, because I want to talk to you about who you think the angel is at the second half of chapter 23. So now we're going to get into our workbook. You can get this workbook on Amazon. So main themes, of course, it was the law, and it was God's grace and mercy and love shown in those laws. But then we have, in the second day of activity, we have theological implications. So the theological implications here is, in these laws, we just really see God's wisdom and his love and his character. And in these laws, we see what God values. And then the application of that is, how do we bring those values into our modern society? That's one thing that we can actively look for. So now let's get into our individual verse. I picked out that famous one, the eye for an eye. You ready? It's Exodus chapter 21, verse 23. So Exodus 21:23. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Again, I just said it in the synopsis, but God knows our heart. He knows our heart that is sometimes kind of weak when we are hurt or when a loved one is hurt. And so I think these laws stress God's mercy, actually, and his desire for humanness. So the last thing we're going to talk about is Exodus 22, verse 21. And that is our study verse for the week. So that verse is, you shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Gosh, this is so different. What I got from my observation is how different this is than how strangers were treated in Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, we talked about that when we were studying the book of Genesis. But one of the things I know is strangers were ushered in, and they would be put on this slab, cement slab. And if they measured the length of the slab exactly, good to go. If they were too big, their feet were chopped off where they were too long for the board. If they were too short, they were stretched. It was horrific. It was inhuman. It was awful. And so that's what one of the things that this can reference is, don't treat strangers like that. But he actually references Egypt and how they were strangers in the land of Egypt. And look how that turned out. Don't treat people like that. And what this kind of stresses is kindness and mercy and grace. And boy, can we bring that into our society right now, can't we? You know, I love how God stresses that kindness and that mercy and that grace. And we can do that. You know, strangers implies people with different faiths, people that look different than us, people that act different than us, and yes, people who might have a different lifestyle than us. Doesn't mean we need to agree with them, but it does mean that we need to show kindness, mercy, and grace. So sometimes that's kind of hard. Me too. So anyway, my friends, you know, I hope your week is going well. Keep commenting, even though sometimes I don't get it. One of these days it'll all pop together and I'll get them. And press like on those, because I am seeing those likes on the videos. And tell your friends about this. We're going through the Bible. We've gone through 4 books: Luke, Acts, Genesis, Exodus, and I am majorly studying for our 5th book, our 5th workbook. So friends, I love you. And what are we putting at the feet of Jesus today? I know. Let's put God's values and how he values crime and how he values law, and see how we can bring it into society today, at least into our hearts and how we treat people. So I love you, friends, and God's got this.